I used to think cheating was something only broken women did, the ones in crumbling marriages with cruel husbands or lifeless homes. But my life looked picture perfect on the outside. And yet, I still opened the door that ruined everything. I remember the exact moment I realized I was no longer the same woman who said, "I do," in that pale pink chapel 2 years ago. It wasn't a grand epiphany or some cataclysmic fight. No, it was smaller than that. A Tuesday morning. The baby, Sophie, was wailing from her crib, and I stood over the sink, washing bottles with one hand, spooning cold coffee into my mouth with the other. I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. I didn't look unhappy. I just didn't look like me. That version of me, the wife, the mother, the woman who left her career behind to stay home, just for the first year. She had bags under her eyes, milk on her shirt, and a kind of stillness in her chest that wasn't peace. It was absence. And Josh hadn't kissed me like he meant it in months. Josh is my husband. Kind, steady, predictable. The kind of man who folds laundry right out of the dryer and leaves gas in my car. He loves me. I don't doubt that. But over the last year, our conversations had shrunk into logistics. Did Sophie poop today? Did you pay the gas bill? Can you grab more wipes? We were good parents, even good roommates. But the love that once sparked across a room, that had dimmed into something quieter, something colder. It didn't help that after maternity leave, I begged to go back to work, even part-time. Not because I didn't love Sophie.
Gå I dort her.
But I needed to feel like myself again. Like a person, not just a role. Josh didn't fight me. He said, "Sure, whatever you need." But the look in his eyes told a different story. He didn't get it. Maybe he couldn't. And that's how I found myself a few weeks later, walking into the Harper & Will's office on the 14th floor. Blouse tucked in, hair clean for once, heart fluttering like I was about to meet someone who mattered. I didn't know it yet, but I had. My new manager's name was Ethan. He wasn't classically handsome, not the way Josh was with clean lines and square shoulders. Ethan had softer edges, messy curls, shirts that fit too well, and a voice like late-night radio. The kind that wraps around you and makes you forget what you were thinking. He was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. He asked questions, real ones, and waited for the answers. I told myself it was nothing when he laughed at my jokes like they were brilliant. When he noticed if I changed my hair. When he offered to walk me to the elevator, even if it wasn't his floor. It was just work. Just kindness. Right? 2 months in, he learned I was married. I saw the moment it clicked behind his eyes. "Oh," he'd said, nodding slowly. "He must be really lucky." I laughed it off. "He is. I think." But I didn't say more. And he didn't press. Instead, he just looked at me in that way of his, like he saw straight through the skin and bones, into the small hungry truth at the center of me. I craved being seen. Not as a mom. Not as a wife. But as me. Whoever me even was anymore. That night I watched Josh sleep. Sophie was finally down, the house was still, and he was sprawled across our bed like always, one arm over his eyes, breathing deep and slow. I tried to remember the last time he asked me how I was. Not how the baby was. Not if I needed more formula. Me. I couldn't recall. I turned away and cried into the pillow silently. The next day, Ethan brought me coffee, oat milk, no sugar, just how I liked it. He remembered. He noticed. I didn't cheat that day. But something in me tipped. That's the thing they never tell you about betrayal. It doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in hundreds of little ones. Smiles that last too long. Lingering fingertips when you pass a folder. The way someone says your name like it's a secret. I started dressing better for work. Wearing perfume again. Tucking notes into Sophie's diaper bag so Josh wouldn't see them. Just scribbles of reminders, but it felt like something more. I wanted Ethan to look at me like that forever. Like I was new again. Undiscovered. Not someone's wife. One Friday afternoon just before close, it started raining. A heavy, April rain that blurred the city skyline outside our office. The whole floor thinned out, people grabbing bags and rushing home. Ethan didn't leave. Neither did I. We stood by the window watching it pour, his sleeve brushing mine. That warmth. That quiet. I felt my chest rise just a little deeper for the first time in months. He turned to me and said, "You ever feel like this isn't the life you meant to live?" It was such a simple question. And I broke. I don't know who I am anymore, I whispered. He didn't answer. Just looked at me. And in his eyes I saw it. The beginning. The first real danger. It started with an email. Subject: Client debrief plus drinks? From Ethan. Time Friday 10:14 a.m. Hey, thinking we should all unwind after the Simmons presentation. Celebrate a little. You in? Bringing a few from the team. Casual. You've earned it. There was no mention of where. No list of names. Just a winking emoji and the word casual. I stared at it for too long. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed back. Might be tight with the baby, but I'll try. Thanks for thinking of me. That was the first lie. Because I wasn't trying. I was planning. When I got home, Josh was already feeding Sophie in her high chair. He looked tired, the kind of tired that hangs in your eyes, not your body. You're home early, he said, glancing at the clock. I leaned down and kissed Sophie's forehead, brushing a damp curl behind her ear. We wrapped early, but we might do a dinner tonight, a little team thing. Josh looked up from the spoon. On a Friday? Just a quick one. To celebrate. He didn't say anything. Just nodded, eyes already turning back to the spoonful of puree. Another silence between us. Another mile between our hearts. I changed in the bathroom. Not the bedroom. Not in front of Josh. A black top that dipped just slightly lower than necessary. A touch of perfume I hadn't worn in months. Something floral intimate. Lipstick I'd nearly forgotten I owned. When I came out, Josh didn't even look up. Text me if you're going to be late, he said, already flipping through the news on his phone. I told myself that was permission. I needed it to feel like permission. The place wasn't far. A rooftop bar downtown with soft lighting and jazz in the background. When I walked in, I scanned for our team. But the truth? I scanned for him. And there he was. Ethan. Leaning casually against the edge of the bar. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, a bourbon in his hand. When he saw me, something changed in his face, like a softening. A pull. The kind of look no one had given me in a long time. You came, he said, stepping toward me. There a reason I shouldn't have? I tried to laugh, but it came out thinner than I wanted. His eyes held mine for a beat too long. No, he said. I'm really glad you did. There were others, 3, maybe 4 people from the office. But as the night wore on, they left one by one. Rides to catch. Kids to put to bed. Dinners waiting at home. And suddenly it was just us. Ethan and me. A quiet table. 2 empty glasses. And a question that hovered unsaid. Why hadn't we left too? I miss being asked how I'm really doing, I said at some point. Too late, too open, staring down into my drink. Not as a mom. Or an employee. Just as a person. Ethan didn't try to fix it. He just looked at me. I see you, he said. And I believed him. When we stood to leave, the air was thick with something unnamed. We stepped into the elevator together. Floor 14 to ground. There were only 2 buttons. Only a few seconds. And somewhere between 14 and 5, he reached for my hand. Just for a moment. A graze. His fingers brushed mine like a question. I didn't pull away. Outside, the city smelled like rain again. Warm pavement and distant thunder. We stood near the curb, facing each other under the streetlight. I should call a car, I said softly, not moving. I could walk you, he offered.
No.
Pause. Yes. He didn't move closer. Not yet. But I did. Just slightly. Just enough to feel the heat between us shift. And then the touch. Not a kiss. Not even a hug. Just his hand, resting at the small of my back, guiding me gently toward the sidewalk. It was nothing. And everything. The ride home was silent. I stared out the window the whole time. The city streaking past in blurs of gold and wet pavement. When I got home, Josh was asleep on the couch, the baby monitor resting on his chest like a shield. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching him breathe. Watching the life I was slowly stepping away from. And I hated myself for what I felt. Not guilt. Longing. Not for my husband. But for the man who saw the emptiness inside me. And didn't look away. The next day, Ethan didn't message me. Not until 3:22 p.m. Just a single line. You okay? I stared at it for 10 minutes before I replied. I'm not sure anymore. It was supposed to be one night. One night in a hotel for a presentation Ethan and I had been working on for weeks. A pitch to a high-profile client outside the city. We'd both worked late, poured ourselves into it. I told Josh about the trip 2 weeks in advance. It's just overnight, I'd said, setting Sophie's bottle on the counter, not meeting his eyes. There's a hotel booked through the firm. I'll be back by dinner tomorrow. He barely looked up from his phone. Okay. He didn't ask which hotel. Didn't ask who I was going with. He just said okay. And I left. We checked in just after 6 p.m. Ethan wore that same navy coat I'd always liked on him. The one that brought out the darker green in his eyes. He was quiet as we rode the elevator. Both of us suddenly aware of the shift in atmosphere. We weren't in the office anymore. My room was on the 9th floor. His was on the 10th. Or maybe the front desk just said that so it sounded harmless. We didn't make plans. We said we'd meet in the morning. That we'd order room service and rest. But I knew. Even before I unlocked the door and stepped into that neutral beige too quiet room. I knew. I didn't eat dinner. I couldn't. I paced for a while. Scrolled endlessly on my phone. Looked at photos of Sophie and felt the ache in my chest. That familiar maternal tug. I missed her with something feral. It was like a part of me never left her side. And then, I thought of Ethan's hand at the small of my back. Of the way he'd looked at me under that rooftop bar light. Of the quiet between us that somehow felt louder than anything Josh and I had shared in months. And I reached for the phone. He knocked softly. No tie. No jacket. Just a white shirt untucked, sleeves rolled like we weren't even pretending anymore. Hi, I said. My voice caught in my throat. Hi, he replied and stepped inside. We didn't talk. Not at first. He sat down on the edge of the chair by the window. I stood near the bed, arms crossed like I could still stop this. But I wouldn't. I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't sleep, he said finally, looking out over the parking lot below. I didn't want to be alone tonight. I hesitated. Neither did I. He didn't rush. He didn't even move toward me at first. He just looked at me, the kind of look that isn't about beauty or desire. The kind that says I see you and I want all the broken pieces anyway. I should have told him to leave. I should have said we can't. Instead, I stepped closer. We were inches apart now. His breath was slow, controlled. Mine was anything but. Still he didn't touch me. Say stop, he whispered. But I didn't. And then the first touch. A hand brushing. I don't even remember the full conversation, just fragments. Wet roads. Someone ran a red light. Intersection near 5th and Hamilton. Ambulance already on scene. Broken legs, broken arm. Lucky to be alive. Lucky. That word rang in my ears like a cruel joke. The hospital was cold in a way hospitals are always, too bright, too sterile, too full of reality. Josh was already out of surgery when I arrived. His leg in a cast, his arm immobilized, face pale but intact. His eyes fluttered open as I approached. Hey, he croaked, voice dry. I wanted to cry. Not just from fear or relief, but from shame. I should have been a better wife. I should have never let this happen. I sat beside him and took his good hand in both of mine. I'm here, I whispered. I'm not going anywhere. And I meant it. In that moment I did. He spent 4 days in the hospital. I was there for all of them. I brought Sophie in during visiting hours. I helped the nurse change the bedding when no one else was around. I learned how to manage his medication schedule. Asked questions about physical therapy. I was good. Too good. Because that's what guilt does. It makes you overcompensate. Makes you polish the surface, so no one sees the crack underneath. Josh never asked if something was wrong. Maybe he couldn't see it. Maybe he didn't want to. Or maybe just maybe he knew. And was waiting to see if I'd say it first. The night he came home, I tucked him into our bed and set up a bell on the nightstand in case he needed anything. He watched me for a while, really watched me. Then he said something that broke me a little. You've been amazing this week, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I don't know what I would have done without you. I smiled, but my throat burned. You don't have to thank me, I said. You're my husband. But the word husband felt foreign on my tongue. He reached for my hand, the same hand Ethan had kissed days before, and squeezed it. I've missed you lately, he added. And I knew exactly what he meant. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, Sophie's faint sighs through the monitor, and the echo of my own choices pounding behind my ribs. I told myself the accident was a sign, a wake-up call, a divine intervention. Maybe this was the universe saying, stop now before it's too late. And for a moment, I believed I could, until my phone buzzed. A message. Just 2 words. From Ethan. Still here. I didn't respond. I stared at the screen, my heart in my throat, and slid the phone face down. But I didn't delete the message. And that said everything. Josh had been ready for another round of tests. Nothing life-threatening. Just complications with the way his leg was healing. Swelling pain, some concern about a clot. The doctor said he'd be in the hospital for a few more nights. Maybe longer. I kissed his forehead that morning, tucked his blanket a little tighter under his arms, smiled when he called me his warrior. I smiled like a woman who deserved the compliment. And then I went to work. The office had emptied out early. A quiet Thursday. Rain again. Like it always rained on the days that mattered most. I stayed late. Told myself I was catching up on admin, avoiding the hospital's sterile light. Avoiding Sophie's empty highchair at home. Avoiding my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. But truthfully, I stayed because I knew he was still there. Ethan. He knocked lightly on my open office door around 7:40 p.m. I didn't look up. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded, eyes still on my screen. Liar, he said gently. I closed the laptop. Looked at him. He wasn't smiling. He stepped into the room, shut the door softly behind him. The click echoed like a verdict. You haven't answered my messages, he said. I know. You've been different. I'm trying to be. He didn't step closer. Just one step. Enough for the air to change. You told me that night meant something. It did. But I swallowed. Looked away. But Josh is in the hospital. And I feel like a monster. You're not, Ethan said immediately. You're human. And hurting. And hiding. You don't have to lie to me. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was too close to the truth. I'm lying to everyone. He didn't answer. He just walked to the other side of my desk and sat on the edge, facing me, watching me. I could feel it building again. The pull. The ache. The wild, awful desire to be seen. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. But suddenly he was standing behind me, his hands on the back of my chair, spinning it gently to face him. And I was looking up at him like I did that first week. Unsure, hungry, a little afraid of myself. Tell me to leave, he said, voice low. I didn't. Instead, I reached for his wrist. And that was it. The kiss was fire. Desperate. No slow burn this time. No pretending. His hands found my waist. Mine found his shirt buttons. He lifted me. I don't know how. And sat me on the edge of my desk, sliding aside my laptop, my papers, the framed photo of Sophie I should have never let stay there. I should have stopped. God, I should have stopped. But I didn't. I needed to feel something. And in that moment I felt everything. It wasn't soft. It wasn't slow. It wasn't even beautiful. It was a crash. A collapse. A body saying what the soul couldn't admit yet. I wanted to be ruined. And Ethan, he knew exactly how. After, I stayed on the edge of the desk, shirt wrinkled, hair undone, my mind a blur. Ethan stood against the window, breathing hard, his forehead against the glass. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Finally I whispered, this changes everything. He turned around. His eyes weren't dark. They were soft. No, he said. It reveals everything. I cried in my car that night. Not because I regretted it, but because, for the first time, I understood. I wasn't torn between two men. I was torn between two versions of myself. And one of them was already disappearing. Back at the hospital, Josh sent a goodnight text. Miss you tonight. Sophie's sleeping early. Your mom's with her. I'm okay. Don't worry. Just come by tomorrow. I love you. I stared at those words for a long time, then locked my phone, and sat there in the dark parking lot, with Ethan's fingerprints still ghosted across my hips, and the knowledge that no matter what happened next, I would never again be the woman I was before that desk. I was running late. Josh's doctor had asked to speak with me that morning. Nothing serious, Just updates about discharge plans, adjustments to pain management. Sophie had thrown a fit before daycare, and I spilled coffee down my blouse before I could change. When I reached Josh's hospital room, breathless and apologizing, I dropped my purse on the side chair like I always did. That purse. The one I never used until after the affair began. The one that held everything I never wanted him to see, including my phone. Unlocked. Buzzing. I didn't notice when it happened, but Josh did. Later, I would imagine the moment in my head. The way his eyes must have followed me as I left the room to speak with the nurse. The way his hand, stiff from healing, must have slowly reached for the bag. He didn't mean to be invasive, but he'd been watching me for weeks now. Watching the way I avoided his eyes. The way my smile reached my mouth, but never my heart. The way my body flinched when he tried to touch me. He'd started wondering. And that morning, while I was 10 feet away, out of earshot, he stopped wondering and started knowing. There it was. A thread of messages from a contact labeled E. He hadn't even had to scroll far. Just one preview was enough. Ethan, I will never forget this evening on the table. You tasted like clarity, like truth. That was the message. That was the moment. The ground didn't fall from under him, because it already had. The pieces just finished cracking. I found him different when I came back in. Quieter. Still. His face is unreadable. Are you okay? I asked, sitting beside him, placing my hand on his blanket-covered arm. He nodded once, then looked me straight in the eye. I need to rest. Maybe you should go home for a bit. Be with Sophie. There was no edge in his voice. No fire. Just frost. I didn't see the trap. I kissed his forehead, said I'd be back after dinner, and walked right out of the room he would never again let me back into. Not the way it had been before. He didn't call that night. Didn't answer my texts. Just a single reply around 9 p.m. Thanks for coming today. We'll talk soon. That "we'll talk" hit harder than any scream could have. The next day, he was gone before I arrived. Checked himself out early. Left a note with the nurse. Please don't allow visitors without my consent. She read it to me with an apologetic look. I'm sorry, she said. He was very firm. I stood there in the hallway, in front of his now empty room, heart in my throat, cold seeping into my fingers. He didn't know. Somehow I knew he knew. When I got home, the garage was open, but his car wasn't there. Inside, his things were still untouched, but his drawer in our bedroom was empty. Just that one. The rest still intact, like he'd left in a hurry, but had enough clarity to know he wasn't coming back tonight. And on the kitchen table, my phone, placed carefully on a white dish towel, like evidence. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed and read Ethan's message over and over again. I will never forget this evening on the table. The irony was unbearable. I had done it to remember who I was. And now the man who once said he'd love me through anything couldn't even look at me. 3 days passed. No call. No texts. No noise at all. Josh's silence was louder than any accusation. Then on the 4th day a letter. Folded. Handwritten. Left in the mailbox like a goodbye no one wanted to speak aloud. I didn't even make it past the 2nd line, before I fell to the floor. I read the message, Rachel. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to catch you. But now that I know, I can't unknow. I can't touch you without seeing him. I can't lie next to you without hearing his words. I love you. I will always love you. But this, I can't come back from this. Not this. Josh. I didn't cry right away. Not because I wasn't broken, but because something in me had already known this was coming. You don't set fire to a life and expect it to stay warm. Ethan messaged me that night. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen. Then I placed the phone face down again. Same table. Same silence. Same choice. And for the first time since it all began, I realized the choice had already been made. Not between Josh and Ethan. Not even between love and betrayal. But between truth and who I was afraid to be. And now, the truth had burned everything down. I buried my face in her hair and breathed her in. Josh kissed me on the cheek absently. How was the pitch? Good, I said, trying not to shake. I didn't mention the hotel, or the look in Ethan's eyes when I left his bed, or the fact that I had erased every trace of what happened, except the part that still lived in my chest. I smiled like nothing had changed. But everything had. That night, I lay in bed with Josh beside me, snoring softly, Sophie asleep down the hall, the house quiet again. And I stared into the dark, wondering how a single moment could carve such a deep line between before and after. I crossed that line, and I couldn't go back. It had been 2 weeks. 14 days of silence. Josh hadn't come home. Sophie had stopped asking for him by name and started calling every man in a blue jacket at the park daddy, with a tilt of her head that broke me every time. I told myself I deserved that. All of it. The silence. The not knowing. The ache of a life unraveling one invisible thread at a time. I hadn't seen Ethan either. Not really. There were messages still. Gentle ones. Careful ones. I'm here when you're ready. Tell me what you need. But what I needed was to stop needing. And I didn't know how. The first time I saw Josh again, it was at a cafe near the hospital. He chose the place. Asked to meet in a message that was short and typed like someone holding their breath. I arrived early. He arrived on time. When he walked in, I stood up too fast. My coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug. He didn't comment. He looked different. Not thinner, just sharper. Like everything soft about him had been sanded away. Hi, I said breathless. He nodded. Saturday. Folded his hands on the table. No ring. I'm not here to rehash it, he said. I just want to talk. Once. Clean. I nodded. I couldn't speak. He let a long silence pass between us before he said it. I think I would have forgiven you if it had been once. My chest constricted. I opened my mouth. Closed it. But it wasn't once, was it? No, I whispered. It wasn't. His throat tightened just barely. I kept trying to figure out when it changed, he said. At first I thought, maybe it was me. Maybe I wasn't enough. I mean, Christ. I was in a hospital bed and still blaming myself. It wasn't you, I said quickly. Josh, it never was. He looked away. Not angry. Just hollow. You were my home, Rachel. Tears pressed behind my eyes like glass. I still love you, I said. I still. He raised his hand gently. You don't get to say that. Not now. Not like this. And I nodded. Because he was right. He took a breath. Swallowed hard. Part of me wishes I never saw that message. That I could have just gone on pretending you were tired. Or distant. Or distracted. I looked down at the table. My knuckles were white. But then I think, maybe it's better I know who you really are now. That one hurt. Not because it was cruel. But because it was honest. I didn't plan for any of this, I said, voice shaking. I didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy us. I know, he said, soft. That's what makes it worse. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He didn't throw blame like daggers. He just looked at me like I was a ghost of someone he used to trust. Someone he couldn't quite mourn, because I was still sitting in front of him. I'll never hate you, he said finally, rising from the chair. But I can't love you either. Not now. Maybe not ever. And then, he left. I sat there for 10 full minutes after he was gone. People came and went around me. Lattes were poured. Orders called. Laughter echoed from a nearby table. And I sat in the middle of it all, like someone who had lost a limb and didn't realize it yet. That night Ethan came over. I let him. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. Are you sure? I'm sure I don't want to be alone tonight, I said. He nodded, stepped in, closed the door. He didn't touch me right away. Didn't try to kiss me or take my hand. Just sat on the couch and waited for me to speak. So I did. I ruined everything. You were already drowning when I found you. I used you. I let you. I turned toward him, tears in my voice now. I don't know what to do next. He exhaled slow. Then let's start with breathing. We didn't sleep together that night. We just lay next to each other, fully clothed, our hands intertwined. His presence felt warm, safe, like a bandage, not a cure. And I realized I didn't love him. Not really. He was a mirror, a vessel, a storm I ran into when my house caught fire. The next morning I made breakfast alone, packed Sophie's things, dressed her gently, brushing her curls the way Josh used to. And I finally did the one thing I hadn't done since all of this began. I looked in the mirror and told myself the truth, that I wasn't a monster. But I was the reason everything broke. That I wasn't in love. But I was desperately searching for something I'd lost. That I wasn't sure what came next. But I was ready to start living with the consequences. All of them. Josh and I never got back together. Ethan and I never became something real. But Sophie grew. And so did I. Not into the woman I was before, but into someone who could stand still, tell the truth, and finally, stop running.